I have no doubt at all that he is going to be remembered as an icon of reconciliation and forgiveness.
We all saw him as probably the one hope that South Africa ever had of a peaceful transition from what it was to what it eventually became.
His legacy is about people taking their lives into their own hands and taking responsibility for their lives individually and collectively.
It is one of the most famous images of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela walking to freedom through these prison gates. As a correspondent here, I was lucky enough to cover the momentous events that followed, events that determined the very future of this troubled country. This is the story of the prisoner who became the president, one of the great iconic figures of modern history. The boy whose destiny it was to change South Africa was first given the name Rolihlahla, meaning troublemaker. It was a school teacher who called him Nelson as he grew up in rural Transkei in the Madiba clan, part of the Tembu royal family. When his father passed away, Nelson was moved to one of the king's homes, known as the Great Place. Unfortunately, the hut Nelson Mandela was born in no longer exists, but when his father died, this is the hut he moved into. Now, don't be misled by this. This is the compound which belonged to the King's Regent who was looking after Nelson Mandela. The plain truth is, he had a fairly privileged upbringing. Mandela spent hours observing how the Regent dealt with local people's grievances. Well, the young Nelson Mandela will have got his first experience of local debate and politics and democracy from meetings just like this one. But it would be 65 years before Mandela's dream of real democracy for everyone in South Africa would be fulfilled. When he was 22, Mandela fled a proposed arranged marriage and made for the great city of Johannesburg, where he became an articled clerk in the office of a white lawyer. He also joined the African National Congress.
He was a leader of the African National Congress, and therefore he was one of those people who everybody met.
Nelson Mandela dedicated himself to ending apartheid, the system by which the Afrikaner government sought to separate the races. Nelson Mandela qualified as a lawyer himself, and he cut an imposing figure.
He was a very dignified kind of man, and he was a professional. I mean, he was a lawyer. So you can imagine that he was a very impressive type of person.
In 1952, Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo did something unheard of at the time. They opened the first black legal practice in Johannesburg. Here it is, derelict now, but at the time it was a prime location right opposite the city's magistrates' court. Now, the white authorities didn't like this, but Mandela was defiant. He said they were besieged by clients, many of whom had fallen foul of the apartheid laws.
In many cases, a lot of them really didn't have money. He would sympathize and then take the cases, even when he knew that he would not be paid for those cases.
How difficult was it in those days to be a black lawyer?
It was not easy for them. He was prevented from continuing in a case by a magistrate who would not recognize him as an attorney. And he said, the manner in which he walked into court was an arrogant manner, and he didn't believe that an attorney would walk into his court in the manner in which Nelson Mandela walked. They were accustomed to bowing and scraping before those in authority.
Was he an arrogant man in those days?
In the eyes of whites, he was arrogant, uncompromising. He subscribed to the slogan of the time that the road to freedom passes through the jail.
He strongly believed that black people were not born to be slaves. And if you remember, he also came from one of the royal families. And therefore, he was born a chief or a king, if one would really say what it was.
In 1958, Mandela, who was divorced from his first wife, met and married a beautiful and fiery social worker, Winnie, 16 years his junior. Mandela originally pursued a peaceful road to secure majority rule. He toured the country organising branches of the ANC. The authorities cracked down hard.
Both of them, he and his partner, Oliver Tambo, were arrested and charged with high treason.
My mother had taken food parcels to him when he was on trial. She was often the only white spectator in the gallery. And then she brought my young sisters, tiny little girls in their school uniforms, to the court one day, and Winnie Mandela gave them a little kiss. The white police officers and security people around it absolutely hated this.
After a marathon trial lasting 5 years, Mandela and his co-defendants were found not guilty. But by now, an even more hardline government under Hendrik Verwoerd was trying to impose grand apartheid, under which blacks would become citizens not of South Africa itself, but of separate so-called Bantustans set up in remote parts of the country.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighbourliness.
Resistance to the new laws grew. When 10,000 people surrounded the police station in Sharpeville, the police panicked and shot 69 dead. The Sharpeville massacre completely transformed the struggle. The authorities cracked down on dissent and banned all political organisations. By now, Mandela and others in the ANC had realised that non-violent protest would never end apartheid.
They quoted Chief Albert Luthuli that we have been knocking on your door for over 30 years. And it was like knocking on the door of the deaf. There comes a time in the life of every nation that you either succumb or revolt.
Mandela's growing frustration with peaceful protest was shown when he gave his first ever television interview. It was a scoop for ITV by ITN's Brian Widlake.
Do you see Africans being able to develop in this country without the European being pushed out?
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Soon after giving this interview, Mandela convinced the ANC to embark on violent resistance. He founded an armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, or Spear of the Nation, which began to carry out acts of sabotage.
I was a young teenager in Pretoria. My parents, the most prominent activists against apartheid. I remember my dad saying, this is an omnipotent machine. There's just so much power and wealth and privilege invested in this apartheid edifice that it'll never give up.
One was aware of what the South African government was doing, and it was pretty brutal to anybody who opposed it.
In Britain, horror at the Sharpeville massacre drove people to act, and the anti-apartheid movement was born.
Evil and repulsive doctrine which says that a man's legal status, a man's political rights, economic opportunities, social position shall depend solely upon the color of his skin.
The new movement drew in many young activists.
I was involved at university in the late 60s in a campaign. We wanted the university to disinvest in South Africa. I was actually campaigning against a friend of my father's who was a principal of one of the universities in southern Africa. At the same time, there were people with Hang Mandela t-shirts, as you probably know. It was very controversial in Britain. We felt we had to tell the world that something was completely wrong with South Africa, that something had to change. And Mandela was the symbol.
He's not the saint that he's portrayed as, but that doesn't mean that he isn't a very great man. But he was quite ready to do something quite determined if it was necessary at that time. It was a mistake because it unfortunately resulted in lots of people being killed and an alienation of support for them.
Other members of the ANC fled abroad, an exile that would last many years.
It was a very big wrench, but other people were in prison. Other people had been killed by the South African police. Never dreamt that it would be more than a year, let alone 27.
In 1963, further serious charges were laid against Mandela. He and others were accused of sabotage, and this time the charges carried the death penalty. The trial was dubbed the Rivonia trial, so called because of the location of the farm where his co-accused were arrested.
The government supporting media published day in and day out with captions that these are the terrorists. There is only one punishment that can be imposed, and that was the death sentence. Mandela and the other accused made it quite clear to us that our defense is going to be a political defense, that you gave us no option.
In his opening speech to the Supreme Court here, Mr. Mandela said that the ANC had tried to use peaceful means, but he said the Sharpeville massacre had changed everything. It had certainly changed the terms of the struggle. The conclusion of the speech gave the key insight into how Mandela was thinking. He said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities." And then came the crucial final sentence which persuaded white South Africa that Nelson Mandela meant business.
It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
So you persuaded him to insert these words, if needs be, and that was to save his life?
Yes, I thought so. He's saying merely that he is prepared to die may be considered as arrogant, seeking martyrdom. And I said, Nelson, you haven't been through this in order to die. You want to live and see it come.
So he was given life imprisonment. Did he believe that he was going to be in prison for the rest of his life?
You know, the Africans show with the three. George, 3 years. 3 years, that's all it's going to take, and we'll be out.
Mandela would have to endure 9 times that long, 27 years in prison, most of it on the dreaded Robben Island, before the tide of history would turn. The apartheid regime considered Nelson Mandela and his ANC colleagues such a threat to its existence that it didn't just put them in any old prison on the mainland, but on Robben Island behind me here, several miles off the coast of Cape Town. Did you believe in the 60s, when you were a young man, that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist?
I did feel that he enjoyed a fair trial and that the judgment which was given was justified.
And because the government was convinced they were terrorists who posed a direct threat to the apartheid system, the regime on Robben Island was notoriously tough, the conditions harsh the warders brutal. So this is it. This is cell 5, where prisoner 46664, Nelson Mandela, spent his time on Robben Island. It's tiny. You can almost stretch across. It's barely 6 foot. There's a bed, but not much of a bed. It's a thin mattress, a few blankets. This is the way that Nelson Mandela lived.
You got a tin plate all the same. You got the same porridge, soft porridge for breakfast, but the African got a teaspoon of sugar, the Indian and colored got a tablespoon of sugar. The important thing about the conditions were that it was a microcosm of apartheid society.
Prisoners were forced to do hard labour, the gruelling and utterly futile work of breaking rocks, first in the courtyard and later in the quarry itself. 8 hours a day for 13 years, Nelson Mandela and the other political prisoners worked at this lime quarry. At the end of each day, they were drenched in sweat, covered in dust. Their hands were bloodied and blistered. But later, Mandela said he quite enjoyed working here. He felt invigorated, seeing the trees, hearing the birds, feeling the wind. But there was a problem. It was to cause permanent damage to Mandela's eyesight due to the unremitting glare of the sun. But right from the start, Mandela conducted himself with extraordinary dignity and nobility.
One could see from his demeanor, from the way the prison authorities reacted to him, that he was already a cut above the others.
Well, the white government thought that by incarcerating the ANC leadership here on Robben Island, they were solving a problem. This is the courtyard where the prisoners had to do their work. They were breaking up rocks here, but they were also able to get together, to talk, to plan the way forward. Mandela meeting other leaders like Walter Sisulu. And it may just be that inadvertently the apartheid regime were sowing the seeds of their own downfall. Although the authorities were happy to let him rot in prison, they knew they couldn't let him die in prison.
The most awful, devastating event would have been if Mandela had died in prison. That South Africa, that the government would not have survived.
How much did he miss Winnie?
A lot. He rationalized that I've married the struggle and that Winnie was part of it, and he was proud of her.
The stress of such a long separation would later take its toll on their marriage, and Mandela knew he had sacrificed his family as well as his own freedom.
In prison, he quickly brought himself under self-control. He did not want to show the other side, the enemy, any chink in his armor.
When he went to jail, he was an angry young man. And it took the 27 years for him to mellow.
Mandela wrote his autobiography on the island. It was copied in minuscule writing and smuggled out by Mac Maharaj when he was released in 1976.
And we used that skill to transcribe the manuscript, make its concealed compartment. I then transcribed that into a computer disk when computers came in. And when Madiba came out of prison, I gave him that on a floppy disk.
Conditions inside the prison gradually eased, but outside, tremendous pressures were building up. The government responded to the increasing resistance by the black population with ever greater force. The 1970s and 80s were decades of escalating bloodshed. Even white students were beginning to demonstrate against the regime.
Nelson Mandela, you and other political leaders are in prison and the people are not free.
And as the awful truth about apartheid became visible to the wider world, a growing international protest began to make itself heard.
We just called to say we love you. We just called to say Until you are free, no man, woman, or child, whatever color or culture they may come from, are really free.
He was upset that the slogan was Free Mandela. He actually made it quite clear during the negotiations that he wanted to be the last political prisoner to be released.
It demanded both the pressure of black South Africans and the pressure of the rest of the world. And the rest of the world had to make it clear to the white minority in South Africa that they had to open up.
A more enlightened group within the ruling party could see that ever more brutal repression was not the answer. Compromises would have to be made with the ANC leadership.
I nearly lost my job in 1986. The penultimate question of one of the media representatives was, did I foresee that the country could have a black president? And I said yes. And would you be prepared to serve under him? And I said yes.
The government began discreet negotiations with Mandela, and he was moved from Robben Island to Pollsmoor prison and eventually to Victor Verster prison, where a procession of visitors came to negotiate with the ANC's leader-in-waiting. By the time Nelson Mandela moved into here, it was widely acknowledged, even by his jailers, that he would soon be released. He was brought cases of wine, he had his own cook, and any number of visitors. In short, Nelson Mandela was holding court in prison.
We thought that if we spoke outside the house that was allotted to him, we would be safe from the bugging devices. But it later transpired that there were microphones in the flower beds.
I met him the first time in December '89. He was brought under cover of darkness into my office, which later became his office here in Cape Town next to Parliament. He was taller than I expected. He stood ramrod straight. I found him to be a good listener, to be an analytical thinker, and I liked him. We left that meeting with a sense, I can do business with this man.
In pursuance of my opening address to Parliament, I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m.
A process with one inevitable conclusion had begun, and soon Nelson Mandela would taste freedom for the first time in 27 years. When, in 1990, Mandela did finally make that historic walk to freedom through the gates of Victor Verster prison, South Africans, black and white, could scarcely believe their eyes. Around the world, millions watched, entranced by the images.
First of all, there was a feeling that, no, this is not on, this can't really be happening. This is too good to be true.
An even larger crowd had gathered at the City Hall in Cape Town to hear the first words Nelson Mandela would utter in public after 27 years of enforced silence.
They sent word that he would not be coming. There was a concern over his security, and they said he was not coming. And I said, hey, I told him, I said, if he doesn't come here, there won't be a Cape Town you'll be able to recognize. The people here are going to go berserk.
Mandela finally made it to City Hall, where the atmosphere was electric. It was through here Nelson Mandela came, and it was from this very balcony that the world heard the first words from Mandela for more than a quarter of a century. It was getting dark, it was noisy, it was chaotic, but it all added to the incredible sense of drama and history.
today, the majority of South Africans, black and white, recognize that apartheid has no future.
The important thing was try and get the first interview with him, and we knew he was going to head back to Soweto. Chasing him around South Africa wasn't a very good idea because of all the security and because of the ferment in which the country suddenly found itself. We had no idea what to expect. There were odd little hints. He'd never seen small microphones before. We put a small microphone and he said, what's that? And the second thing, which I think was even more astonishing, was that he was singularly unbitter, conspicuously so. You know, we were looking for, I suppose, the kind of tabloid headline, you know, Mandela, I was beaten up in prison. All in the past, he said.
Our demand is a very clear one. But as I have said on previous occasions, we are quite aware of the fears of the whites in the country. And I am convinced that in discussions between the ANC and the government, we will be able to find a solution which will be accepted by everybody, black and white.
The tone of his speech to a massive crowd in the football stadium in Soweto was also calm and conciliatory.
Go back to your schools, factories, mines and communities. We are going forward. The march towards freedom and justice is irreversible. Africa! Africa! Haibuye! Amandla!
People couldn't believe that somebody who had been so harshly treated by a regime could emerge so unscathed and so unbitter and so ready to shape South Africa along rigidly democratic principles.
It was against this background that delicate negotiations then began to work out a transition from apartheid to full democracy. The first meeting took place at the president's official residence in Cape Town. Tell me what it was like meeting Mandela for the first time.
You know, it is difficult to explain something that is both emotional and mixed with remorse and mixed with expectation. But it was a great moment of feeling that at last the country is now a hope, not only of survival, but of moving forward.
But the peaceful transition to majority rule was already under threat. Violence flared in the townships between supporters of the ANC and Chief Buthelezzi's Inkatha Freedom Party. Later it transpired that a secret government unit was inciting the violence. It reached a gruesome low point with the murder of 46 people in the Boipatong massacre in June 1992.
They said they want boys and men, so they couldn't find them. So they found this lady and a 3-year little child on the bed, and they started stabbing them.
I'm not going to be part of any decision to restrain our people when they are being killed in this cold-blooded manner by a lunatic, by an idiot, placed here by the Pretoria government.
Mandela, I think, thought that our police had something to do with it. That suspended the negotiations and the very start.
Elements in the security forces which, against my orders, against my policies, were continuing to be involved in ongoing violence and ongoing creation of tension.
Mr. Mandela thought you were involved in that and thought you were giving orders, didn't he? He didn't believe that you didn't know about that. Was that the source of the tension?
He always qualified it. He said either that or I wasn't in control or I was just looking away and allowing it. He never actually accused me of knowing about it and being directly involved.
Even when he lost faith in de Klerk, over the question of violence. And when talks broke down at Kodesa, he was the first to say, continue to talk to the other side.
Then another catastrophic threat to the process. One of the most high-profile activists against apartheid, the communist leader Chris Hani, was murdered. Many feared that South Africa would now erupt into widespread violence. Mandela once again appealed for calm.
A cold-blooded matter like this is something that is totally unacceptable, and the anger on the part of the people is therefore understandable. But we ourselves will do everything in our power to contain the thing.
Long live the fighting spirit of Comrade Chris Hani, long live! Long live!
He had a bit of a struggle to convince many of the hardliners in his party that this was the right thing to do. But he used that great moral authority, that courage, that wonderfully clear philosophy about what was needed to convince them that he should move South Africa in this way.
At the same time, white right-wing extremists were intent on stoking the fires of hatred.
How serious? So serious that we will never stop. It's better to die as a free and independent man, to live as a slave of the African National Congress and the communist world.
But the country did not descend into the widely predicted chaos. And in December 1993, Mandela's efforts to chart a peaceful transition to majority rule were given international recognition when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize jointly with President F.W. de Klerk. A formula was eventually found to hold elections with universal suffrage, which would lead to a government of national unity for a limited time afterwards. At last, black South Africans were able to vote in national elections for a president for the very first time.
Everywhere you looked, there were long, long lines of people. People were waiting for 3 and 4 hours in the very, very hot sun. The first time, the majority of South Africans speaking out about how they wanted to be governed.
For us, this was a number one. This was a first. The interesting was that it was not just black people, it was black and white, Indian, colored, everybody voting for whatever party they wanted. But we were quite confident that we were going to win. We had worked very hard.
Even my parents who have passed away have been wishing to see this one day, but they couldn't.
Most people who fought for this, they are not here. They couldn't take us to the promised land. But now here we are.
It was amazing. Just the fact that for the first time in the history of this country, a black man was going to be inaugurated as president of this country.
I accordingly declare Mr. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela duly elected President of the Republic of South Africa.
So Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the troublemaker, had finally done it. The inauguration ceremony took place in Pretoria, the very city where Mandela had been sentenced to life imprisonment 30 years before.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
I remember the days so well, standing right here, surrounded by black South Africans, listening to Mandela's voice ringing out. It was a day of great hope, of great optimism. And the most extraordinary thing was that you had the enforcers of apartheid, the South African military, Air Force jets, flying across the sky, endorsing and celebrating South Africa's first black president.
And they shouted out, "Viva the South African Air Force, viva! It's ours. This Air Force is now ours." And then I thought, well, Nelson, you've achieved something.
It just made you feel so good. And also that it had all been worth it. That those who had died, those who had suffered, had not suffered in vain.
Mandela had become the first black president of South Africa. Now he had somehow to negotiate a peaceful way forward for a country divided in so many ways. As president, Nelson Mandela realised that if he was to succeed in uniting the country and steering it away from violence, he must first win over the Afrikaners. Nothing typified his approach more than the 1995 Rugby World Cup.
Yeah, Mandela had just been in power for 1 year. The democracy was young, it was fragile, and rugby was a very divisive symbol. It required extraordinary leadership to persuade his own people that suddenly this Springbok rugby team were, as he put it, our boys.
So embracing the Springboks was part of building South Africa, was part of embracing everyone. Obviously realized that the Afrikaners love rugby. When he was in prison, he told me the stories how they boycotted the Springboks. You take it away from them, what are you doing? Are you building or are you breaking down? And he's a builder.
The perfect opportunity for building a sense of unity came with the decision to ask white Afrikaner rugby players to sing the African part of the national anthem.
The song of black protest against white rule, against precisely people like them, against precisely the Springbok rugby team.
It was very important for us to know the words and to sing it with a passion. So it was quite funny, you know. It's 5 different languages, and some of the guys have difficulty speaking their own language, let alone other languages.
And then came Mandela's masterstroke when he donned a Springbok jersey, the captain's very own number 6 shirt.
Madiba, the Springbok on his heart. It was incredible. It became incredibly emotional. And my number was on his back. That was me, you know. I would run through walls. I would play until I can't play. You know, they would have to absolutely scrape me off the field. And every player felt that.
And then suddenly, somewhere it starts. Nelson, Nelson, Nelson.
Nelson, Nelson, Nelson.
Extraordinary moment. It was white South Africa rendering homage to Mandela. It was white South Africa crowning Nelson Mandela king.
South Africa have won the World Cup.
Did we play for him? Absolutely, we played for him. But we played for more than him. We played for what he wanted us to play for, and that's for everyone in South Africa.
The example set by Mandela, forgiving the wrongs of the past, was seized upon by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, set up to deal with the legacy of the apartheid years.
With the injuries of the past so severe, he had to say, we don't forget, we find a way to forgive. And we created that bridge through our TRC, where we were trying to exchange truth for amnesty.
I think his greatest contribution has been, from the day he became president, has been in the field of reconciliation, the way in which he reached out.
White South Africa was very terrified, and they were terrified because what they had done or what they had been complicit in doing, and they couldn't imagine that black people could forgive them. So I think it was very important that he seemed to embody this forgiveness.
Gillian Slovo's parents, Joe Slovo and Ruth First, were old ANC colleagues of Mandela's and long exiled from South Africa. In 1982, her mother had been murdered by a parcel bomb sent by a South African police unit.
My father was part of the ANC's negotiating committee, which agreed on the compromise of the TRC, and the night that it happened, he said, I realise that what I have done is agreed to let those killers who killed my wife go off, and my only satisfaction is that I will have forced them to live in a society that they fought so hard not to have into being.
I remember asking Mandela if he was giving whites too easy a time when I interviewed him shortly after he became president.
Many in your own party say that you've perhaps been too preoccupied allaying the fears of the whites.
What many people don't understand is that we had to achieve this smooth transition from an apartheid state to a non-racial society. Without the policy of reconciliation, there would have been civil war in this country. It was threatening, and it was not an empty threat.
Mandela's determination to forgive and move on from the past provided a template for everyone in South Africa. There was very little violence, certainly not the bloodbath that many had feared. And when I accompanied former prisoner 46664 on his return trip to Robben Island, he explained how the years in prison had shaped his philosophy for the new South Africa.
Politically, was the sacrifice worth it?
Yes, certainly. Oh, yes. Some of the most important decisions, politically, I made them here. And it was here that I learned the art of trying to look at ourselves.
It had been a sacrifice for his family too, and one casualty of Mandela's long years in prison was his marriage. Winnie had been persecuted by the authorities during her husband's incarceration, but in 1991, Winnie had been found guilty of kidnapping a 14-year-old boy who was suspected of spying on her. He was later murdered. She was also investigated for misappropriation of ANC funds. Her repeated infidelity seemed to be the final straw.
Prisoners do not expect their partners to lead a monastic life, but they did expect some sort of restraint in relation to the public image.
Nelson and Winnie divorced in 1996.
It had a terrible impact on him.
Was deeply, deeply hurt. His divorce from Winnie was one of the most painful things that could have ever happened.
If his private life was troubled at this time, Mandela was revered all over the world, nowhere more so than in Britain.
I raise my glass to your health and to the prosperity and happiness of all the people of South Africa.
You spent many years campaigning then for his release. Did he live up to expectations when you eventually met him?
To be in his presence as I've been on, luckily, I mean, I've been very fortunate. Someone who was a hero is someone that I was then able to meet.
Okay.
Everything that people said of him, that he was a gentle giant who was courageous but without bitterness, proved to be right. Mandela said to me that he'd been in Parliament Square many, many decades before with Oliver Tambo. And he'd said to Oliver Tambo, "Will there ever be a black man honoured in this Parliament Square?"
He would live to see himself honoured there. His statue was unveiled in 2007. Nelson Mandela was later to find happiness with his third marriage to Graça Machel. And since he left power in 1999, South Africa has continued on the largely peaceful course set by Nelson Mandela. But many problems remain. White South Africans had long enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle in Africa's richest country. And since Mandela's time in office, a growing black middle class has begun to share their prosperity. But a huge amount remains to be done for the poor in South Africa. What Nelson Mandela achieved for this country was truly remarkable, a relatively smooth transition to democracy when one seemed virtually impossible. But what he and his successors failed to achieve was a quick and meaningful improvement in the lives of many of these people behind me here, the poorest of South Africa. I know it troubled him right up to his death.
We failed to address the issue of HIV/AIDS successfully. We have failed in bringing down dramatically the high crime rate. At the bottom of the challenge which we face with regard to poverty and the rest in South Africa lies the absolute necessity to improve our education system.
South Africa is still not a functional nation. We're growing up. South Africa is a democracy still in its childhood.
So how will history judge Nelson Mandela, prisoner number 46664, who became president?
His spirit, the type of spirit that fights on, not only to win, but also for fairness.
He never stopped climbing that mountain to bring justice to people in every part of the world, and that's why he will remain the great inspiration for millions of young people.
Mandela represents that hope, that epitome of joy and moral authority, and so we're all indebted to him for a quality of leadership that puts him at the apex of global leadership for our time.
That's Mandela's legacy, that whatever you do, empower your people. Because when you empower them, it doesn't matter whether you're there or not. They will go on.